at least prolong, physical life. A psychiatrist tries to restore or prolong mental health. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross is both doctor and psychiatrist, but her work is with those whose health cannot be restored. She tries to help the terminally ill and their families to face death without fear, and even come to know, in the silence of their spirit, that strange emotion we call peace. Poets and philosophers have written much on death and dying. The poets have looked into their own hearts, and the philosophers have searched their own minds. Dr. Kübler-Ross is among the few to have spent hours listening to the dying themselves, observing how they move, stage by stage, to the threshold of death.
When a patient is informed that he has a potentially terminal illness, his first reaction is usually one of shock and denial. We call that the no, not me stage. That's when patients can't believe that it happens to them. They may go shopping around from physician to physician or from hospital to hospital and can't believe that this can happen to them. The best help we can give patients in this phase is to first double-check whether this is our problem or really the patient's problem. I think 9 out of 10 patients who appear to be in a stage of denial are not really in a stage of denial. They know very well, but they sense that you can't talk about it. You know, if you go into a room and say, look at those lovely flowers and the nice weather outside, they know that you only want to talk about nice things. And so they keep to themselves what they really want to share with another human being. If you are sure that this is not your problem, then you simply say to a patient, whenever you feel like talking about it, I will be reachable. And the patient will then call you when he's ready to talk about it. And that is very often not between 9 a.m. and 4:30 p.m., but at 2 or 3 in the morning, when all the defenses are down, when it's quiet and dark, and it suddenly hits them, it's really me who has cancer, for example. If they have one human being who can talk about it comfortably, who doesn't run away, who doesn't tell them, oh, you're going to get well again, when they know that they're not going to get well, then the next stage is usually one of rage and anger. That's the why me stage. That's when patients become very difficult for everybody around. They displace the anger onto the physicians, to the nurses, to the hospital chaplain, but also to the family who takes care of them. They are the patients who, when the intern walks into the patient's room to start an infusion, the patient greets them with the words, did you ever hit the vein the first time? You know, the kind of patient I'm talking about. Unfortunately, we take this anger very personally. You know, it's a professional insult to us to question us. And that's very sad because we then avoid the patients. Nurses wait twice as long until they go back into the patient's room. And family avoids visiting them or comes in quick-like and goes out again. This is very tense, uncomfortable atmosphere. What we don't teach enough is that this anger is a blessing and really a compliment to you, not an insult. We had a 21-year-old man who had lymphosarcoma who was dying, who was kept for 6 weeks in a protective isolation, which is a bit like a sterile prison where anybody who walks into the room has to put the gown on, the mask, because they're very vulnerable to infections. He was terribly isolated. Nobody walked into his room. People told him that he had only anemia like his grandmother, and he knew very well that this was not true. I went in to try to see if I can help him in his really utter loneliness and isolation. And he was in a stage of rage and anger. He gave me a very nasty look and turned his back towards me. And I tried everything I've learned from my dying patients, and nothing worked. And just as I headed towards the door, thinking, you know, deep down I have plenty of patients who appreciate my precious time, I realized I'm doing exactly what I tell my students not to do. I walk out on him. So I went back into his room and I looked at the wall that this young man faced for 6 weeks. And I suddenly had a very strong feeling, we call that the gut reaction, of real anger. And I said to him, doesn't that make you mad? You lie here on your back, totally alone. And for 6 weeks you stare at this wall covered with these green, pink, and blue get well soon cards. And I was angry about those get well soon cards. And he turned around and he poured it out. It was like opening floodgates. He talked about all the people outside who can go shopping, who enjoy the sunshine, who pick a fancy get well soon card when they know very well I'm not going to get well. And then I didn't have to pure fuel in the fire. He went on and on and on. He talked about his mother who spends the night on the couch. Big deal, he said. Every morning when she leaves, she makes the same statement, I better get home now, I have to take a shower. And then he looked at me almost full of hate and he said, you two are no good. You two are going to walk out of here again. Do you understand what the anger is all about? They're not angry at the mother or at me or at the nurse. The more you are a picture of life, health, pep, energy functioning, the more pep you come into this room, the more you rub in what this patient is in the process of losing. And if you can accept this not as an insult to you, but as a compliment, to remind you of all the things that you can do that you take for granted every day until you lose it. This is what I mean when I said it's a compliment to you. If we cannot take it as a personal insult, but say to those patients, gosh, I would be angry too, get it off your chest, ventilate it, even if they displace it onto the physicians, onto the nurses, and also onto God. Many, many patients during this period of time question God, why do you let this happen to me? And I think they should be allowed to say that. My chaplain students have a problem. Not all of them, but some of them. They are very good as long as my patients displace it onto family or staff. But if they dare to be angry at God, they come very quickly and try to put the brake on and say, "Psst, not to say that." And I always tell them, what's the matter with you? God can take it. I try to help my patients to say those things and not judge them or, label them as they're bad Christians or whatnot. Parents of dying children, family members of dying patients go through the same stage. We had the mother of a dying child who stood outside of the room of her dying child. She looked like a pressure cooker ready to erupt. And I simply walked over to her and I said, you feel like screaming, don't you? And she turned around. She said, do you have a screaming room in the hospital? And I said, no, but we have a chapel. And then she really gave it to me. She said, who needs a chapel? In a chapel you're supposed to be nice, quiet, and grateful and pray. And I want to scream and yell at God, why do you let this happen to my baby? And then I took her to my office, and they don't scream, We're always afraid that they get hysterical or they scream or disrupt the hospital routine. This woman simply cried on my shoulder and told me how she sat, this is in Chicago, in a cold parking lot in the winter, all alone in a car, yelling and screaming at God, why do you let this happen to my baby? That is the why me stage. And I think if we don't judge these, quote, nasty patients or these difficult family members who make us very guilty, if we help them to express and ask why me without the need to give them an answer, but help them say those things, then sometimes in 10 minutes they pour it out, not always in a ladylike language, but how they really feel. And they're much more comfortable. Dying patients need much less pain medication after this. They don't call the nursing station all the time. They don't make the family guilty. It's a tremendous help. But you have to go and see them when they are ready, not when it's convenient to you. When a patient has finished the why me stage, has gone through the rage and anger, they very often then go through what we call a bargaining stage. Bargaining looks like peace, but it's not peace. It's like a temporary truce, where a patient says, yes, it is happening to me, but is almost always in form of a prayer to God, if you let me live one more year, I'll be a good Christian, or I go to the synagogue every day, or I'll donate my eyes or my kidneys or what have you. What they promise is not relevant. Most patients don't keep their promises anyway if they get well. The psychological purpose of the bargaining is that they have for the first time in their life really faced that it is happening to them, not to somebody else. And what they're asking is for a little bit of an extension of time so that they can put the house in order, finish unfinished business, maybe see who's going to look after the children. This is the last time to make a will, and this is very important for you, the healthy people, to help those patients then to finish whatever unfinished business they have. Most patients bargain with God, but a few patients, and especially those who don't know God or who are not religious, will also bargain with you. And I'll give you an example of what such a bargaining sounds like. We had a very difficult patient, one who always complained and nagged to an extent that the staff would tiptoe by her room because each time they would walk by her room, she would call them in and complain about something. One day she called me in and she was terribly nice and friendly and a very different patient. And I asked her what happened to her, and she said she had a big dream that she could get up one more day and get all dressed up and look and feel like $1 million. And if I could make this possible, that she could leave the hospital for one day, which implied not to be dependent on injections for pain around the clock. If she could have one day, then she would promise to be a good patient. And you understand that we needed this very badly too. We asked her how come she only asked for one day. This is highly unusual. Usually mothers pray, if you let me live long enough until my children are out of school, and the day they're out of school they add a quickie prayer until they get married and so on. This woman's dream was that she could attend her favorite son's wedding. And if she could do that, she would come back to the hospital and accept whatever would be. Well, we used very unorthodox means, and we made her dream come true. And after she was gone, I was wondering what it must be like for this very difficult patient to come back and to keep her promise. So I waited for her in the evening when she came back, and she saw me in the hallway. She greeted me with the words, "Don't forget, Dr. Ross, I have another son." That is the most typical characteristic of the bargaining. What they promise is not important. The importance is that this is really progress. But you also have to know that it is not final peace yet, that it is a temporary truce, which is your last opportunity to help those patients before they become depressed. When the bargaining is over, then they get very depressed, and they go through two types of depressions, which I think are important to differentiate, to know, because we have to help our patients differently in the two stages of depression. First, they go through what we call a reactive depression. That means they mourn past losses. They mourn the loss of a breast, or they grieve that they can't be home with the children anymore, they can't hold a job. They talk about all the things that they have lost already. And members of the helping profession and families are usually very good during this period of time, I guess because all of us have gone through losses and can empathize with it. But then patients go through a very difficult period, and that is what we call the preparatory silent grief. And that's when they begin to mourn future losses. That means a man who is dying suddenly begins to realize that he's not losing one person. Like if I would become a widow, everybody would allow me to mourn and grieve for a year for one beloved person. A man who faces his own death has to face the reality that he's losing everybody and everything. Is 1,000 times more sad. And in order to really endure this, to be able to cope with this tremendous quantitative loss, they are beginning to what we call to decaffect, to wean off. That means they symbolically bid goodbye first to relatives and acquaintances, and then they want to see the children once more, and then at the very end they usually like to be with one or two people who can sit silently and quietly, where holding of a hand becomes much more important than words. And it is during this weaning off period where it's almost like the world of interest shrinks to less people and less things. This is a time when they don't worry about politics anymore or what's happening out in the world, where they don't even want to hear about home anymore, because that would only add to the burden. It is during this preparatory grief where men have it much worse than women, because in our society, for some strange reason, it's regarded as unmanly to cry. And I find this very pathetic, because it takes a man to face this and to cry, and we say this to our patients. I very much resent nurses, for example, sometimes walk into those patients' room and they see a man silently weeping in his pillows, and they are very uncomfortable in the face of those silently weeping men, and they go in and say, "Cheer up, it's not so bad." Not so bad for whom is the question. We go into those patients' room and we say, "It takes a man to cry." That means I admire you. Do you have the courage to face it? If they're allowed to cry, if you don't make them feel unmanly or coward or weak or what have you, they will cry on your shoulders. They will talk about how hard it is to say goodbye to everything you have loved. And if they are allowed to grieve before it happens, then they can reach the last stage, the stage of acceptance. And that is probably the hardest stage to describe. Most of my patients, and I've interviewed and followed about 800 patients in the last 3 years, almost exclusively children, most of them would reach the stage of acceptance if it were not for two main problems. One of them are physicians who cannot let go, who believe that their primary duty is to prolong life. And when a patient dies on them, it's almost like a feeling of failure, and that means that they then have to add more and more life-prolonging procedures to a point where a patient is ready to let go, would really love to die, and doesn't want to be stuck with needles every few moments, doesn't care a bit how his electrolytes look like the moment they die. If a patient is then not left in peace, and that does not mean deserted, but if you know when to call it quits, he could reach the stage of acceptance and die with peace. If we do not let them alone, if we add more and more life-prolonging procedures, many of these patients then regress again and go back to a stage of anger and depression and bargaining. That is one problem. The other problem that is quantitatively a much bigger problem are wives. Not only wives, but wives especially. Family members who cannot reach the stage of acceptance, who cannot let go. They hang on to their dying husbands and implicitly or explicitly say to them, don't die on me, I can't make it without you. And you appreciate that it's very hard for a man to die with peace and equanimity if we make them feel guilty for dying on us, you know. And in these cases, you really have to help either the physician or the family so that they can also go through the stages and hopefully reach the stage of acceptance before the patient dies. The stage of acceptance is not a happy stage, but it's a feeling of kind of inner and outer peace, where one of my favorite patients, I think, put it most beautifully. She was simply sitting in her bed, holding my hand, and she looked at me very, very peacefully, and she said, my time is very close now, and it's okay. That is the best description I can give you of a stage of acceptance. It's not bitterness, there's no more fear, there is very little physical pain, and I'm not talking about sedated patients who can't talk anymore. Our hope is that we can keep patients alert and awake and pain-free, and hopefully allow them to die at home, not in an institution. That is a stage of acceptance, and that has to be differentiated from a stage of resignation. If you go to nursing homes, to old people, you see many, many old people who talk as if they were in a stage of acceptance. They say, Dr. Ross, there isn't much that you can do for me except pray to the Lord that he takes me soon. And I presume that this man is, 83 years old, that he's in a stage of peace and acceptance and really means what he says, if I don't listen. And I simply shared his hopes with him, and I thought that he was in a stage of acceptance, but didn't listen to him. And about 4 weeks later, I went back to visit him. That was when I was called back to Switzerland, where my own mother had a stroke. I needed to see this old, wise man in a stage of acceptance. And he wasn't this old, calm man anymore. He greeted me with a sense of real urgency and didn't say hello. He said, Dr. Ross, did you pray? And I said, no, and didn't finish my sentence. With a great sense of relief, he said, thank the Lord, I was so afraid he might hear you. I asked him what happened to him, and he said with almost a mischievous smile on his face, he said, do you remember the lady, the 73-year-old lady across the hall? He fell in love, and he wanted to live again, and he was so afraid that somebody prayed too soon, too fast, and the Lord might take it seriously. And this, I think, is a very good example, not only of not listening, of only hearing what we want to hear. I wanted to be this old man in a stage of acceptance. But this is a beautiful example as a differential diagnosis between acceptance and resignation. Resignation is a feeling of bitterness. What's the use? I'm tired of living, or I'm tired of fighting. And I think 80% of our nursing home population is in this stage, because the quality of life is such that it's not worth living and just sitting and waiting until death comes. The tragedy of our old age homes is that we don't allow people to live until they die. We give them room and shelter and maybe color television sets and sometimes even luxuries. But what we don't allow them to do is to give and to serve and to do something for other people. Living to me is only living if it's a give and take. And I think we have to invent more programs where old people's assets and wisdom and experiences over decades can be used more. My own bargaining before I die is that one day in the next 10 years, hopefully, we have nursing homes where the main floor of every nursing home is a daycare center, where working parents can bring in the children. They are taken care of and loved by those old people who can come downstairs for half an hour or whatever they have the energy for. They would love them, they would read them stories, they would be very much loved and needed and wanted again. And if their arthritis bothers them, they could go upstairs, and retire. And I think the children and the old people could love each other and would need each other, and the old people could live again, not just sit until death occurs. It's programs like this that we have to invent to help people to live until they die. And that is very true not only of dying patients, but also of old people who are just put away in a nursing home. Nobody needs them anymore.
Years ago, Dr. Kübler-Ross made her decision to walk beside others into the valley of the shadow of death. As a young woman, she left her native Switzerland to work with medical teams in the refugee and concentration camps of war-torn Europe. She once wrote, "Anyone who saw the sights I saw and smelled what I smelled, the stacks of clothing, the thousands of baby shoes, would always be concerned with death and dying." From that time to this, she's been a tireless traveler between the worlds of the living and the dying. The time not spent on her patients is given to seminars and lectures before doctors, nurses, and clergymen, teaching them to hear the silent language which the dying often speak.
Dying patients know that they are dying, and they also can tell you many times when they are dying. But they don't say this in plain English many times. And I think it's very important that we teach that there is not only, the common language that we are familiar with, but that there is also a symbolical language and a non-verbal language. For teaching purposes, we put it together into 3 languages that dying patients use when they try to convey to you their own awareness of their impending death. The simplest language is plain English. If an old woman says to you, "I know I have cancer and I'm not getting out of this hospital anymore," everybody knows what she's talking about, that she talks about her dying. Those patients are understood by anybody, lay people and professional people. But those are the patients who need you the least. Because anybody who can talk about their own impending death in plain English has come to grips with their own finiteness and is usually at least partially at peace with their own death. And that means that they end up helping you more than the other way around. The people who need help, who need our help very much, are people who are afraid to die, are children who have no language to talk about dying because we raise them in a way that they are not familiar with death as a normal part of life. We have these horrible signs in the hospitals. No children are allowed in the hospital under age 14 or 16, which I find a shame. Children who have to die, or adolescents who are just starting to live and then they have to die. Also young adults and patients who come into the hospital and have a very short time between an accident and their actual death. So they have very little time to come to grips with their own death. Or old people who are petrified to die. All these patients who need us terribly much use a symbolical language. And there are 2 kinds of symbolical languages. One is a symbolical non-verbal language that is used almost exclusively by young children between the ages of 3 and 10. And a symbolical verbal language which is used by older children, adolescents, and grown-ups. And I can give you an example of each of these languages. In order to understand the symbolical language, you have to understand what the fear of death is. Most people, if I ask, what are you so afraid of? Why do we feel so negative and so helpless and so petrified when we walk into a room of a dying patient? Well, it's because they remind us that we are finite too. And then I said, what is so terrible about that? It should be beautiful, because if our lifespan would not be limited, you couldn't enjoy living. If it would go on forever and ever and ever. But people don't see it this way. They're afraid of the unknown. Some people are afraid of punishment after death. I would be afraid of leaving my small children behind. Every human being has their own associations with the fear of death. But this is a very small part and almost an irrelevant part of the fear of death. The real fear of death is repressed and unconscious, and that is the part we have to understand if we want to understand the communications of our dying patients. In the unconscious, we cannot believe that we are mortal. I believe that it shall happen to thee and to thee, not to me. Or like a psalmist who says, 10,000 shall die on our left and 10,000 on our right, but it shall not happen to thee. If we are forced to conceive of our own death, we can only conceive of it as being killed. And it's very important to understand that. In the unconscious is no representation of dying of old age, of natural causes, just falling asleep and not waking up. The real fear of death, if I would try to put it in one sentence, is a fear of a catastrophic, destructive force hitting you and you can't do a thing about it. It's this feeling of tininess, impotent rage in the face of a big catastrophic murderer. Like if an atom bomb would be dropped over this house now. By the time we are aware of it, it would be too late and we couldn't do a thing about it. That is the real fear of death, and you have to understand that our society is the most death-denying society because we have now man-made these weapons of mass destruction. We have, in a sense, acted out all our destructiveness. We can kill thousands of people with chemical warfare, bacteriological warfare, atom bombs. We've actually been doing it. And because of this, we are such a death-denying society. Well, children, if they try to talk with you about dying, they will not have words for that. And they use very often drawings. Drawings, to me, are the most beautiful way of expressing, of talking with children about their own dying. This is a universal language. A boy in Switzerland who had an inoperable brain tumor, nobody knew whether he was aware how sick he was simply asked to draw a picture. And he drew a big, ugly tank. And behind the tank was a cute little house with trees, grass, sunshine, door and window. And in front of the tank, where the barrel is, in front of the barrel was a tiny little figure with a stop sign in his hand. That was his picture. If this child gives you this picture, that means of all the people in the world, he has chosen you to talk with you about his awareness of his impending death. And the question is, how do you help such a child? It is very important that you then use his own language, that you do not tell him, talk about it, or would you associate to this picture, or, force him to verbalize when he gives you this communication in a non-verbal, symbolical way. The simplest symbolical non-verbal language is to simply hold and hug and love him, which is an international language too. If you can do this and don't run away and simply hold and hug and love him, this child is then able to ventilate his feelings. He will then talk about his impotent rage, about his sense of tininess in the face of this big destructive death. And then his next picture, the same child drew, was a very beautiful flying bird. Everything was black and white except the upper part of the wing was painted yellow. And when he was asked what this was, he said, but naturally this is the peace bird, flying up into the sky with a little bit of sunshine on my wing. This was the last picture he drew before he died. And this to us is our most favorite example, naturally, of the symbolical non-verbal language. The picture of the tank and this tiny little soul standing there with his stop sign in his hand. represents a mixture of, stage of rage, anger, bargaining, and depression. And the last picture of the peace bird is naturally stage of acceptance. If children have one human being who is not phony with them, who really can listen and knows that they too know about their dying and can convey this in their own language, children die much, much easier than grown-ups, and they are very, very beautiful to work with. Many children use not a symbolical non-verbal language, can verbalize about it, but again, not in plain English. They use a symbolical verbal language. And I'll give you an example of that. We had an 80-year-old girl in our hospital at La Rabida Children's Hospital, a very beautiful girl who was dying. She was alone in a room, inside an oxygen tent in the middle of the night. She was one of these children who never made the staff uncomfortable, never talked about her illness or about dying, and many people doubted that this girl had the slightest idea how sick she was, which, I know that patients know, but very few people give children especially credit that they know and can talk about it. Well, one night, in the middle of the night, this little girl called her favorite nurse, and she asked the nurse out of the blue sky, she said, "What's going to happen when I'm inside this oxygen tent and the fire breaks out?" And the nurse says, "Oh, don't worry, nobody smokes in here," which implies there won't be a fire, don't worry, and she walked out. Outside of the child's room, this nurse did something for which I really admire her for the rest of my life. She stopped for 1 minute, and she did what I would call, she listened to her gut reaction. And she sensed deep down inside that she missed something terribly important. You understand what I mean when I say she didn't know up here what she missed, but she sensed it. And this young nurse had the courage to call the nursing supervisor in the middle of the night. And that takes courage. Because most people would think of it perhaps for a glimpse of a moment, and then they would immediately dismiss it and say, "Oh, well, it was not so important." Not that it's not important, but we don't like to inconvenience people in the middle of the night, because they might not like us anymore. This young nurse was lucky because she had a nursing supervisor who understands the symbolical language very well, who's a very beautiful person, very non-judgmental. And the old nurse then told the young nurse to go back immediately to this little girl, because this girl is ready now to talk about her dying. What she said, naturally, is a beautiful concretization of what we talked about before, that the fear of death is really a fear of a catastrophic, destructive force bearing upon me, and I can't do a thing about it. The young nurse said that she couldn't do that. She wouldn't know what to say and what to do, and the older nurse accepted that too. She came into the hospital, same night, went into the room of this little girl, and simply asked her, "What did you say about the oxygen tent and the fire?" And the child repeated her question, and the nurse did something very beautiful. She opened the zipper of the oxygen tent, put her chest on the child's pillow inside the oxygen tent, very close to the little girl, and simply said, "Do you think this would help?" And the child started to sob and cry, and the nurse didn't stop her. And after a few minutes of sobbing and crying, this little girl said in plain English, "I know I'm going to die very soon, and I just have to talk to somebody about it." And they talked for about 45 minutes about everything that this little girl had bottled up. This is why it's so important to understand the symbolical language that especially children use. You see, people are always afraid that they don't say the right thing. And this is an illness of our super sophisticated, educated society. What they have forgotten to do is to simply be a human being, to listen to your own gut reactions and trust that you have the right feelings at the right time. I think I learned the most important lesson from the least educated person I've ever worked with in my life. And I have to share this example with you, because people who listen to this program are not all professional people. And they may say, "Oh, well, she's a psychiatrist, or you have to have a PhD or an MD for this kind of work." And that is terribly not true. Every human being who has come to grips with their own destructiveness, perhaps, with their own anger, with their own anguish, who is really at peace with themselves, can do this kind of work better than anybody else. My best teacher I ever had in all these years of working with dying patients was a black cleaning woman. 8 years ago, when I was at this hospital where I had this seminar on death and dying, I was a very lonely soul. You know, I was really an outcast or a black sheep or whatever you call that. Nobody comprehended what this Ross is doing, why is she going around talking with dying patients about dying. And I was a very lonely soul. And during this period of time, I was very, I guess, hypersensitive to other people's response to me and reaction and what they did with dying patients. One woman, a cleaning woman, a black cleaning woman, each time she walked into a room of my dying patients, something happened in that room. And again, a gut reaction. I had no idea what this woman did. But in my search for answers, I cornered her one day and I said to her, I'm sure in a very silly way, I said, what are you doing with those patients? And she became very defensive. She probably thought I reprimanded her, you know, for doing something that she was not supposed to do. And she said, I'm not doing anything, I only clean the room. And I said, I don't mean it this way. Many times after I've been in a room of these dying patients, they look very peaceful and okay. And you must be doing something. Well, she didn't trust me, so she didn't answer. And you know how people snoop around each other when they try to get to know each other without ever talking to each other? We did that for weeks with each other. But one day she trusted me apparently. She began to find out what I'm all about, and I stayed near her to find out what she was all about. One day, weeks later, we had a cup of coffee together behind the nursing station. And she suddenly opened up and she gave me one of the most important lessons I've ever learned. She started out sharing with me how she grew up in a ghetto in fantastic misery and poverty. She knew what hunger was and cold floods and sick children and no money. She included examples of fantastic sufferings, like she was in one of the county hospitals with a 3-year-old child, waiting in a waiting room for a physician to come to look at her child, and her 3-year-old boy died in her lap of pneumonia, waiting for a physician to come. Examples like this, but without one glimpse of bitterness or accusation, much more like, this is the story of my life. And I just wanted to say to her, why do you tell me all this? What has this to do with my dying patients? And as if she could read me, she looked at me and she said, you know, Dr. Ross, death is not a stranger to me anymore. He's like an old acquaintance, and I'm not afraid of him anymore. And sometimes I walk into the room of your dying patients, and they look so scared. And I cannot help but walk over to them and touch them and say, it's not so terrible. And she really meant it, because that's how she felt about it inside. Do you understand that I promoted this woman to my first assistant, much to the dismay of my academic colleagues? Because I think she taught me that it does not matter terribly what you say or even what you do. What counts really is how you feel inside about it. And this woman was at peace and was not afraid. And she was able to touch them and convey that in her own language. And she really helped people. I think the more educated we become, the more we are worried that we say the right thing and do the right thing. And you know, you can go into a patient's room and preach and say fancy things, if deep down inside you feel like, I hope she doesn't die on me. That's what the patient is going to pick up, and not all your fancy words. And it's from these people, I think, that you can learn more than anybody else. What the dying patients teach us is not only what it's like to be dying, but I think if you dare to really deeply and personally get involved with them on a very deep gut level, not up here, you go a little bit through the stages with each of these patients, and each one helps you a glimpse closer to its acceptance of your own death. And that is the gift that they give you if you dare to get involved with them.
What Dr. Kübler-Ross had learned from her own involvement became the subject of her book, titled simply, On Death and Dying. The book was acclaimed by reviewers, became a bestseller, and has been translated into 7 languages. It has brought help and hope to thousands, and serve to focus attention on the one experience we shall all undergo. Courses on death and dying are now offered in seminaries and medical schools, on college and even high school campuses. Dr. Kübler-Ross plans now to write another book, which will deal with children and death. Herself a mother, she has found in terminally ill children some of her most profound teachers in the art of living.
My work with death and dying really started in Majdanek, in a concentration camp after the war. And I was very impressed how very young children in that place, thousands of children were killed, how they not only were aware of their own impending death, but used drawings or poetry to talk about what it's like to be so young and to have to die. To me, drawings, children's drawings especially, and poetry are one of the most beautiful ways of expressing all the feelings that you have that you could never say in any other words. I would like to read you some of these poems. I'm working with parents also of dying children, and I think we just don't give them enough help. Parents who have a child who is dying, that's one of the most difficult things in the world to face. Also, the siblings of dying children are terribly neglected, and I can show you some pictures of siblings, how they deal with death and dying. But we do this work without charge. We see all our patients without charge, but we get very, very beautiful gifts. And this little booklet that I received from one of the mothers is one of probably the most precious gift I ever received in all these years that I've worked with dying patients. And I wanted to read you some of these poems. This is written by a mother whose 3.5-year-old boy had leukemia. And I've seen them in counseling to help them to come to grips with it. And after a year, the mother and the father reached the stage of acceptance and was really at peace, accepting it not only here but here. And she gave me for my birthday a booklet with poems that she wrote. Each time she felt that she came to grips with something, she wrote a poem what she experienced at that time. I don't think this woman ever read my book. I don't think she knows about the stages of dying. I'm not sure about that. But every poem is one stage. And I'll read you a few of them because I think this tells people most what it's like to come to grips with death and dying, especially when it comes to a child. The first poem she writes is called A Fun Day at the Leukemia Clinic. You hear the paradox of the title already, A Fun Day at the Leukemia Clinic. A child near death I saw today, his smile too slow, his face too grey. His gaze not here but far away, and I wondered, tomorrow mine, this way. I hold my own and give him a kiss. His grin in return leaves a feeling of bliss. So I almost believe there is nothing amiss. Please, let him always stay just like this. He's warm and alive and eager to smile, jumping and hopping and running a mile. An innocent babe without cunning or guile. All I ask is to keep him just for a while. Who is to stay and who is to go? Until the last moment, who is to know? There is no rhyme or reason what this must be so, but I'm screaming inside, never mind, never know. This is what we would call a partial denial. She knows up here that's going to happen to her child, but inside, never mind, never know. She can't really believe it yet that this can happen to her own child. And then she does something very moving and very beautiful. I mentioned earlier that if you cannot accept your own death, your own finiteness, that except or short of going through a life of suffering, which means that in your lifetime you have gone many, many times through those stages. So when a terminal illness comes or death comes, you're no longer afraid. Like the cleaning woman who said, death is not a stranger to me like an old acquaintance. If you have not had the privilege of having a life of suffering, and I call that a life of privilege in a symbolical way, the next best way to come to peace with your own finiteness is to identify with people who suffer and go with them through the stages and accept their death And each time you can do that, that will help you to come closer to its acceptance of your own death. This mother does exactly the same thing. She cannot accept her own child's death, but she somehow senses intuitively that if she could come to grips with Kenny's death, Kenny is a roommate of her little boy who's also dying of leukemia. If she could accept Kenny's death inside, that this might help her later on to face her own child's death. And so she's doing exactly that. She writes a poem to Kenny, who is not her own child. Please die soon. He's 8 years old, though he looks much more. He has been kept too long in front of death's door. I wonder how long before he dies. He's a ghastly preview before our eyes. I think of my own and what I will do and what I can give when this hell he goes through. I'm scared and I cry. I don't want him to go. But damn it, if he must, let it not be so slow. I'm skipping a bit and read you the next poem after Kenny died. She writes a poem to Kenny, Goodbye with Love. You left us last night, and quickly so. I guess you knew it was time to go. Better than those who would have to stay for one more hour or another day. It was time to leave while you still could be, though physically bound, in spirit free. You still could smile and still could sing, still could do so many things. There are some battles that can't be won. The fight was hard, but now it's done. You fought so well and gave your best. And now, dear Kenny, it's time to rest. Do you feel the acceptance of Kenny's death? But that is not her own child yet. She tries it with a lot of other children. She goes through fantastic rage and anger. I'll read you just a few lines to give you a feeling of what parents go through. The song of the intern is an expression of her rage and anguish, which is displaced onto anybody who is touching her child now. I'm the intern, big and strong. Believe me, I can do no wrong. I do things quick, I do things fast. Who cares if things are done half? Tomorrow maybe I'll practice on you. Bone marrow, shots, and an IV or two. In a couple of years I'll really know how. You'll just have to bear with my clumsiness now. You get the feeling of the rage and the anger that will be displaced onto anybody now who touches her child. And it's very hard, not to feel insulted and not to react with anger. If you can accept this as an expression of this mother's anguish and get it off your chest, I would feel this way too. Then you can help this mother, and this woman has gone through a lot of rage and anger and destructiveness. And after weeks and weeks of this almost unbearable anger, she's now going through what I called earlier the preparatory grief, where she's going to look into the future of what it is going to be like when her own Jeffy is dead. And if she can do that before he dies, she might have a chance to really reach a genuine, authentic stage of acceptance. Her child's name is Jeff, and you have to know that to understand where she's doing it in this poem. The poem is called The Hospital Playroom. Come to the playroom and look inside. See all the toys of the children who have died. There is Beth Ann's doll and a book from Mary, a bat and a ball and a mitt from Larry. Kenny's crayons are used each day, and the coloring books belonged to Kay. Boxes of toys and boxes of joys, that's all that's left of the dead girls and boys. I wonder what of Jeffy's will give to this graveyard that said these children lived. His fire engine or the red old trike, a puzzle, a book, or his shiny new bike. It's supposed to be fun to come here and play with a sick little child made happy today. But my eyes and my heart from this place want to go. It's filled with the ghosts of the children we know. Did you hear it? Where she's beginning to think of what she's going to give to this children's playroom. Then after she goes through weeks and weeks really of a preparatory mourning and grief, she's now reaching the stage of acceptance, and that is very, very hard for people who have no belief in any form of life after death. This is a woman who has no religious beliefs or concepts, who doesn't believe in immortality. For her, death is total and total nothingness. And you can appreciate how hard it is when you then have to face the death of your own child, when you have absolutely no concepts of anything afterwards. And so she writes a poem to her own little boy who is terminally ill, and the title of the poem is understandably, "Where are you going, my little one?" You see the margin of hope in these first two lines of this poem. He's 3.5 years old when she writes this poem. And the poem is, "I saw a boy on a bike go by. He was 10 years old and blue of eye, slender like you with straight blonde hair, but hard as I looked, you were not there. A group of children playing ball, boys and girls, both big and small. I was restless inside and the panic grew, because tried as I might, I could not see you. You're not really from my little son. You'll always be a special one. Here a short while, then gone somewhere. I could rest inside if I just knew where." Now you have to view again the peace bird as a symbol of acceptance. I glanced up at the clouds as they billowed by, floating free in a peaceful sky. Lovely and light, they had not a care. And finally, my son, I found you there. She writes then one more poem, and that is very typical of what could happen if people would really accept their own finiteness. If you can come to grips with your own destructiveness, and you can realize that you're a tiny little unimportant thing really, and in terms of the universe and of time, you're here a terribly short time. And if you could really accept that and face that, you would live a very different quality of life with very different values. And this mother writes now a very typical poem of what happens to people who have accepted that they're here and together only a very short time, but they really want to live every day more in depth and with more meaning, like a bit to live every day like it was the last one, but needless to say, still hoping for 1,000 more. And this is her poem now, and it is called very typical future shock, which means, in spite of all our preparation, if our child dies, it will still be a shock, naturally. I cram it all in now, as much as I can, for today's tomorrow for our little man. Make memories now, and hold them fast, for the future is but a thing of the past. The feeling of panic is slow to leave. I've spent so much time getting ready to grieve. Why is he going? There's nothing last. The future should not be a thing of the past. But some songs are short and some are long. 4 years of perfection, but still a short song. But today he does sing, and he's lively and loud, and the future has become the present to now. Once the mother reached the stage of acceptance, within 24 hours, the little boy started to talk about his dying. He immediately senses that Mommy can talk about it, and it's okay to talk about it now. And he talks here about Kenny, who died before him, and later on he also mentions Beth Ann, who is a little girl who also died before him. And he says, "Mommy, where did Kenny go? He was my friend, and I liked him so." And Mother says, and he says, "Kenny died? Who killed him, Mom? I wonder, was it a gun or a bomb?" Do you remember the concept of death as a catastrophic weapon? And Mother says, "Oh, nobody killed him. He had been so sick that his body wouldn't work, and he died very quick." And Jeffy replies, "Just like me, Mom, and Daddy, and you, and Dougie, and Grandpa, and Shadows too. Where was he, Mommy, when he got dead? Was he playing at home or somewhere in bed? This is his last unfinished business. Are you going to ship me to the hospital again, or do you allow me to die at home? Where was he, Mommy, when he got dead? Was he playing at home or somewhere in bed? I really liked Kenny, and I'll miss him a lot, but nothing bad happened. He did not get shot. He only did die like we all do someday. So long, Mommy, I'm going out to play." A few weeks after these poems were written, the little boy developed a pneumonia, he became very sick and he started to talk again about dying. And he said to his mother, I'm so sick now that I think this time I'm going to die. I think a year before the mother would have said, shut up, don't talk like this, you're going to get well. They always do that. But this time she was able to sit and hear him and listen to him, and she said to him, what do you think it's going to be like? And he thought for a while, and he said, I think what's going to happen is that you're going to take me in an ambulance. Not only is he very smart, he knows that he's going to be shipped to a hospital anyway, but the place where Beth Ann is the cemetery, and he doesn't have a word for it. And the mother said to him, is there anything else I should know about? And he thought for a while, and he said, yes, I think you better make sure and tell Dr. Ross that she puts the light on in the ambulance and makes the sound very loud so that Beth Ann knows I'm coming. And I think one of the most beautiful and typical expressions of a child who has to face dying, whose parents give them no concept of heaven or any form of life after death. If they see that the parents are at peace, they not only come to peace with their own death, but they will be able to make their own heaven. And it's very beautiful. What this heaven consists of is a place where Beth Ann is waiting for him. And beautiful that he picks Beth Ann naturally, because Beth Ann is a child who has had leukemia, who knows what suffering means, and who has gone ahead for him. And all he asks of us, the healthy and the living, is that we make enough noise and we keep the lights on to notify Beth Ann of his coming. That is how beautiful and how peaceful it is when children die and you can talk with them about it and don't shut them up. I love to work with dying children, and the more you work with them, the less you can see death as a nightmare and as a catastrophic, destructive thing. Much more like the peace bird.
Teach me to die. Hold on to my hand. I have so many questions, things I don't understand.
This special program was produced in association with the Division for Film and Broadcasting of the United States Catholic Conference and was another film production of the NBC Religious Programs Unit. Your announcer is Jerry Damon.
Here day after day, trade your fear of parting for the faith that knows.